Everyone, welcome to Dot Point P1, and this is the first dot point on plant production, which we're going to start looking at now. And what we need to do is outline the phases of growth of a monocot or monocotyledon and a dicotyledon that are used for agriculture. Now, these phases of growth here that we're looking at are vegetative and reproductive. So there's two phases of growth that we need to look at. And every plant in the world can basically be classed into the category of monocotyledon or dicotyledon. Now, what we'll end up doing is working out how knowing about the vegetative and reproductive phases of these two types of plants helps us manage those plants. So let's start with what they are. So a monocotyledon is mono meaning one and di meaning two. And cotyledon just stands for seed leaf. So inside the seeds of any plant there is leaves, and monocots can all be identified by having one seed leaf. So when they germinate, they'll have one leaf initially, and then dicots have two. So when they germinate, you'll see two leaves coming out initially. And most plants in the world are actually dicots, and there's a few that are monocots. And the monocots are basically grasses, simple, small plants, generally don't grow for a long period of time. And examples here in agriculture are wheat, rice, and oats. They're smaller, more simple plants that do not grow very tall. Like I said, dicots have, or most plants in the world are dicots. Anything from smaller plants like cotton, agricultural examples here of canola, soybean, lucerne, they're all smaller plants, similar in size to grasses, but they're more complex plants, and we'll look at why in a second. But they're more complex, and they can also be taller. So basically all trees and larger plants are dicotyledons, and we'll look at why that is the case in a second. So we're going to need to look at the stems, the roots, and the leaves, and look at what makes them different between the monocots and dicots. So in terms of stems, in monocots here, there's examples of wheat, rice, and oats here, for example. The stems are much shorter, they're much smaller plants. The xylem and the phloem, which are these indicated by the red dots here, or what we call a vascular bundle, are all arranged throughout the stem. So they're not, as we see over here with the dicot, they're all arranged around the edge because you need a woody core that kind of holds the plant up, because these plants tend to be larger, whereas with the monocot, the vascular bundle can be arranged all throughout the stem of the plant. So that is a major difference between the two, and the stems are generally longer for dicots because they can be larger plants. Moving on to roots, you can see here clear difference of the roots between monocot and dicot. Because a monocot is a smaller plant, it's not going to grow as high and doesn't need as much stability in the soil. It has lots and lots of thinner fibrous roots, and it has a large surface area to suck up water and nutrients, but it doesn't need a really large root to kind of anchor it in the ground in the same way that dicots do. And so they have lots of thin fibrous roots, and they only really penetrate the surface layers of the soil. On the other hand, dicots can be very large, up to the biggest trees on Earth. So they need to have a main taproot, and this goes a long way, many meters into the ground, and obviously more depending on how big the plant or the tree is. And so this gives the plant stability, and it has further roots branching out from the taproot. So you can see the structure of the roots is very different because they have different purposes. You'll also notice on the leaves that the leaves of grasses, you'll notice the veins in the leaves go parallel for grasses, and for dicotyledons they are much more complex, so they're branching. So you have a main vein up the middle with branches heading off to the side. So this is the most easy to recognize difference between the monocots and dicots. Most plants have this type of veination because most plants are dicots. So this is called parallel veination or parallel veins, and this one's called network or reticulate veination. And here's an example of a whole monocot and a whole dicot in terms of how they look different to each other. If we have a look here, now moving into phases of growth. So vegetative and reproductive are basically the two phases of growth. There's also a third phase, or like a kind of pre-vegetative phase sometimes. Some people consider it another phase, and it is called emergence. So once the seeds start germinating, the leaves start emerging, and that first phase is called emergence. But for the most part, generally speaking, we just say vegetative and reproductive. And so vegetative is growth of all the non-reproductive parts of the plant, so stems, roots, leaves, etc. Basically the whole plant except the reproductive parts. And then once the plant has kind of matured, it starts to, or coming towards maturity, it starts to put on reproductive growth, which is the growth of the flowers, the seeds, the buds, etc. And this is the same as in animals, where they start to develop their reproductive organs once they've grown the rest of themselves. There's obviously no point in reproducing unless they have the structure and the other parts to support that. So the first one we're going to look at is a monocot, and I'll just flick this around here. So we can see this is an example of corn. And what I've done here is we've divided this up into vegetative. This stage here is vegetative growth, and this stage here is reproductive growth. And you can see some points around the outside about what happens with the plant, and these are the kind of steps or the stages in the plant's growth. So V just stands for vegetative, and then R around here stands for reproductive. So, and then it gets to maturity. This is the point where the seed germinates and the leaves start emerging from the ground, and then you start getting your first leaf, second leaf, third leaf, and then all the rest of your leaves. This comes to about 8 weeks of age here, when it starts to tassel or put up the male part of the plant at the top. And this is when you can get leaf loss if you get hail here, for example. So if we are, in a second, we're going to be talking about management strategies that you can have with the plant when you are growing it, and to know what you need to do at certain stages. So once you move around here, these reproductive stages start being called blister, milk, dough. This is basically a description of what's in the corn kernel, and what that looks like in different stages. All right, so firstly I'll show you a corn plant. So these are obviously the leaves and the stem and the roots. Here we have the tassel. So if we look at this in combination with the diagram here, we're moving through the leaves. So the plant's growing up, putting leaves on, and once it starts to cross over between the tasseling stage the vegetative stage and the reproductive stage, we have this section called tasseling. So this tassel bit here is the male reproductive organs, which drops pollen down onto the silks, and you can see that the first reproductive stage is silking. When these silks pop out, it's the female part. The male part drops pollen onto the silks, and you get corn forming down here. Now, what happens here, if there's hail, for example, during this time here, this tassel bit will be ruined, and you will not get pollination of the silk, and therefore you won't get any corn growing. So when we look at management strategies later on, if you get hail during this period here during tasseling, you will lose your yield. So that's an example of when it's important to think about this when you're planting. You want to make sure that you're not 8 weeks into your crop growth of corn when maybe it's hail season. You tend to get hail in certain areas during certain times of the year. So you want to try and avoid hail potentially happening around this point of the crop. If hail occurs up this area here, it's not so much a problem, or if it happens this area here, it's not so much a problem. But if hail occurs during this part of the growth, then you're likely to lose all of your yield. Once the silks start to emerge here, the plant needs increased nutrient uptake. And as I haven't mentioned this yet, but back here when the third leaf is growing during the vegetative stage, if or most of the growth of the plant is occurring in the roots below the surface. So if the soil temperature is too low during that time, the plant will die potentially. So you need to make sure that this is planted so that the corn is planted so that 3 weeks once after it germinates, the soil temperature will be adequate. So that, again, that's a management strategy the farmer can use to make sure that their crop is successful. And then as you move around, the moisture or water in the kernel decreases, and then you get starch layer forming. So monitoring the water levels here is important, and not over irrigating if you're irrigating your corn. So we'll look at management strategies a bit more in a second. we'll move on to a dicot, an example of a dicotyledon in agriculture. And an example is potato. And basically, we're going to look at what happens to the potato during the vegetative and reproductive growth phases. So once your shoots break through the surface, we've got our potato planted in the ground, and you have shoots breaking through, and they come out and begin to photosynthesize with their leaves above the surface, and you get adventitious roots developing from stems, and they seek water and nutrients. So during this phase, making sure you have adequate nutrients for the plant is important. Reproductive growth, when leaves reach full size, the flowers form. Seeds from flowers can be used to grow new varieties potentially. The tubers continue to grow, storing starch, and the above ground leaves and stems are generally killed by the farmer with a herbicide, such as Roundup, to kill off the plant at the top before the potatoes are harvested. So in terms of management strategies of what the farmer can do, in the vegetative phase of monocot, you want to be adding fertilizer potentially, because the number of kernels of corn and the size of them is determined at a point early on. Ensure the tasseling occurs and there's not going to be hail happening at that point, and making sure that you're not planting when the soil is too cold to prevent the plants from dying. Reproductive stage and the management strategies that can happen then, you can plant, or you can use more water and nutrients to make sure that the water content is correct for the kernel. You don't want to have too much, but you want to make sure it has enough. Moving on to dicot and potato, what can you do in the vegetative stage? You want to plant during warmer soil temperatures to allow the bud sprouting to occur. And when its germination happens, you want to ensure that there's no pests eating the emerging leaves, so you use a pesticide or insecticide potentially. During the reproductive stage of the dicot, you want to use maybe fertilizer to increase the growth and development, and maybe if you're trying to grow new varieties and cross-pollination of potatoes, then ensuring pollination is adequate via wind or insects. In terms of past HSC questions for this, the first question, there's only been multiple choice questions for this so far in the HSC, but in the diagram, which phase or phases represents the reproductive stages? So this one is where the head of the, assuming this is wheat, this has reached reproductive phase here, where the head is come out and the seeds potentially, and fertilization can happen. So the Y and Z are the ones that are correct there. They're both at the reproductive stage. This is also reproductive stage. Once a plant enters, it moves from vegetative stage to reproductive stage, it is in reproductive stage for the rest of its life. It doesn't ever get out of reproductive stage once it enters it. So the correct answer is Y and Z. This one from 2014, after germination, what is the correct order of the phases of growth? So we had emergence, which I said is sometimes used, and then vegetative and reproductive is the correct answer. Lastly, this diagram shows the early stages of a growth of a plant. To which group does this belong? You can see here we have a taproot all the way through. We have 2 seed leaves, and we have branching veins. So that gives a clear indication that this is a dicot.